Welcome to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. The podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bits in between.
And welcome to this episode of 1202, the Human Factors Podcast, with me, your host, Barry Kirby. Before we get into today's interview, just a quick push from me to highlight that the last episode, the coverage from EHF 2022, is obviously now live. Hopefully you've seen that. This is the first time I've attempted to do an episode that pulls together multiple interviews and deliver them on both audio and video. It was very much a learning curve for me, and I think that's quite obvious in the output, but I'd be really keen to get your feedback. As well as any advice, if any of you out there do this sort of thing, using multiple interviews, using the video software in particular. If you've got any advice for the way I could improve it in the future, I'm really open to do that. Those who are long-time listeners know that this is all very much a learning curve, and we're all on this journey together. But also, if you want to hear more about what we got up to in EHF 2022, then over on Human Factors Cast this week, Nick Rome's interviewed me with my president-elect hat on, and has woven some more of the interviews that I've got. So go over there on Thursday or anytime after Thursday and listen to that interview. And if any of you are patrons on Human Factors Cast, he's also putting up the full interviews I did with all the people I interviewed as well. So there's loads of content come out of that. Anyway, back to this episode. As you may know, I've been doing a lot of work really to try and bring the news and views not only from the UK, but internationally, with the main aim of broadening our horizons a bit and realizing that while we might be on a project or as part of a team or a small team, or you might be a single human factors practitioner on a project, it can feel a bit lonely. But there is a great UK-wide network, as we've just heard about with went to the Ergonomics conference and things like that in the UK. There is that network there, but there is a fantastic international set of networks too. So this is why today I'm really pleased to be able to reach out across the pond to the USA and talk to Chris Reid, who is a Human Factors and Ergonomics technical fellow at Boeing, but he's also the current president of HFES, or the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society out in the States. Chris, welcome, and thank you ever so much for joining us.
Hey, Barry. Thanks for having me.
So, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what is HFES and what is that all about, I'd like to learn a bit more about you and your background, if that's okay. So what is your current role, and what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I'm currently a technical fellow for the Boeing company in the Environment, Health, and Safety Organization. My focus is in human factors and ergonomics, primarily for production and I guess you could say maintenance systems. So we have different divisions or business units within the company, from commercial to defense to service. And so I work across all three of those divisions or business units, looking at ways to improve production safety, service safety, and typically around wearable technology. So I tend to bridge the gap between safety ergonomics and technology intervention for mitigation strategies.
Well, and certainly wearable technology is a real flavor of the month at the moment, isn't it? There seems to be so much potential and so much drive in it. How did you to become a Boeing technical fellow? I mean, that's a heck of a journey. How did you get started? What was your interest in human factors in the first place?
Yeah, so I actually kind of stumbled into human factors. So my undergrad was in computer systems engineering under electrical engineering. I went to the University of Central Florida in Orlando, Florida. And my first job was actually as a computer systems engineer working for a facilities management organization. So think of like organizations that build software to maintain buildings, right? That's essentially what it is. And so we were working on the software. My job was, doing database systems and the front end with the website. And so one of the things I thought about after I graduated was, what else could I do to give me an extra edge on the software, make it more user friendly? I started hearing about that stuff. And so I took classes for a certificate program in human engineering. Some of those classes were like usability, looking at human systems interface, human computer interface, things like that. That ended up growing into a PhD, a master's and a PhD later in human engineering and ergonomics. But it was, like I was saying, it was kind of a stumbling block. At the time, I was just coming out of computer systems engineering field, and I ended up getting laid off. And so that's where that layoff went into like a full-time approach towards the PhD, and I just went gung ho and finished that.
Wow, there's an awful lot of similarities here. That because I sort of did a similar thing. My background is engineering as well, and it's amazing how many people you talk to who seem to find human factors just almost by accident. And even with the the growth of UX and that sort of side of things as well, still people just seem to stumble into it rather than it be, nobody seems to want to grow up to be an ergonomist. They all want to be astronauts and firefighters and things. So yeah, I think that's something we need to look at.
Yeah, and I'm not going to lie to you. So when I did that transition from the certificate program to the full degree, the PhD, I took a class in ergonomics, and it just so happened that the capstone for that class was at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. And so we had the opportunity to work on a real world project. In this case, it was the Leonardo multipurpose logistics module that was going in the back of a space shuttle. And they were basically loading it up with all the arrays, the scientific panels and everything that go inside the module. And so my job as basically this capstone, me and my team, were basically to look at the ergonomics of, the people doing that work. Think of that massive module. It's a cylinder, and you got to put stuff inside that hollow center. And so they had like catwalks going through the middle and people hanging off the catwalks and then moving this giant module and the ergonomics involved with that. And so it was absolutely fascinating. It killed me when it came to ergonomics, and afterwards I was basically stuck. So I think my childhood, Star Trek fantasies came through at that point, and I was like, all right, I found the field. I'm good.
See, yeah, you've for long-term listeners to this podcast will know I have a real thing about the space industry, and I think that's one of the downsides of being over in the UK. We don't have the similar sort of access to NASA, SpaceX, them sort of organizations that quite frankly I would sell my all my children to. Just don't tell them that.
Yeah. By the way, if you do happen to hear my youngest screaming in the background, she's just waking up. I was hearing her earlier.
It's it's one of the things certainly about working from home at the moment, isn't it? It's we're all so used to it. So you started off, you're inspired by that initial working with NASA and your degree. What's been the career path from there? Where you started from there? How have you got to where you're at now?
Yeah, so after I did that transition, while I was finishing my PhD, I did 3 internships with the Boeing company, because Boeing basically sparked my career at that point. It was that capstone was through Boeing at Kennedy Space Center. So I did 3 internships, finishing up. I did them all in the manufacturing area for commercial airplanes. And they were out in the Washington location, which is where our biggest sites are. And from there, graduated. Unfortunately, at the time, there was an economy flop in 2008, 2009. You remember that bubble burst. And there were massive layoffs at the time happening around the world and around the country. And so I didn't unfortunately get to go back full time with Boeing, but my first gig after spending a year unemployed was basically working with the U.S. Army. So I was hired in as a human factors engineer for the Army. From there, got a job with Lockheed Martin. So the first job with the Army was in Massachusetts at one of their research facilities there. Then moved to the NASA side of the house with Lockheed Martin in Houston at Johnson Space Center, and spent several years there as a human factors and ergonomics discipline lead. And then Boeing came back to Boeing right around the end of 2015, and started my technical leadership, career from there. So I came in as a technical lead engineer at the time, and then that led to more senior positions like associate tech fellow and then technical fellow.
Cool. My technical jealousy radar is just raging at the moment. That's a really cool way of showing that you can have the if you take the right opportunities really early on and make the most of them, just exactly how that sort of that career can progress. we're just going to take a really quick break, and then I want to get into a bit more about the sort of some project work you've been doing, and then get into the HFES bit itself and work out, basically tell people a bit more about what you do there. So we'll just be back right after this brief break.
Sounds good.
You are listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. We wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you for your support. You can help further by rating us through your podcast provider, sharing us through social media, and telling your friends and colleagues. Let's work together in raising awareness of the value in putting users at the center of what we do.
And welcome back. I'm here with Chris Reid, the current president of HFES. So, Chris, what's been the most memorable project you've been involved with to date?
I think by default, I would say the current stuff that I'm working on, which is, dealing with exoskeleton technologies in the production workforce for Boeing, as well as international organizations and national organizations, helping them along. But while that's admirable, I have to say the most memorable for me was when I was at Johnson Space Center. At the time, as discipline lead, we were trying to understand astronaut injuries and how they happen while doing spacesuit related activities, or EVAs, extravehicular activities, as well as on the ground while they're doing trainings, like in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, the giant swimming pool in Houston. And so, I was tasked to basically do a massive, data analysis project. We took about 30 years of historical data, stuff that was stashed away in papers, in giant vaults, pulled that stuff together, mixed it with digital information from near current information. And that basically spanned between 1980 data and 2010 data, basically when current EVA technologies came online, with the extravehicular mobility unit spacesuit, the big puffy white suit that you see in orbit. So that was basically my, pet project for about 4 years. So understanding how injuries were happening, understanding where they were happening, who they were happening to, basically data analytics, looking at pattern science. And that eventually, that data project led into the technology development side of the house, where we actually built custom wearable computers and wearable sensor units that were embedded into garments, essentially. So we think of like Under Armour garments and modified those garments with electronic technology, and put sensors around the arms and the fingers, because in particular I was studying fingernail delamination, or basically your fingernails dropping off from working in those environments. And man, it was absolutely mind-boggling how hard it was to condense, large nuggets of technology that you would think of like, oxygen sensors that you put on the tip of your finger to look at the blood oxygenation level. And there's these little clips that go on, pretty cool tech, right? Now imagine condensing that into something that could fit on a fingernail. So we had to create new technologies and new capabilities, at the same time look at how we can squeeze it into the spacesuit gloves and, go up the wrist. And we ended up putting the computers down on the lower back. And it was absolutely mind-blowing. Now take that complexity, put it into an oxygenated environment, squeeze it into a spacesuit, and put it 40 feet underwater. And the complexity is mind-blowing. Yeah, and I think the only thing harder than that was actually getting it to space, and so it was absolutely amazing. We got it on. It took about 3 years of work. We basically created an injury detection system, that you can embed inside the space. It was the first time anybody's ever done that, because normally you try and keep hazards away from the astronauts, but we just embedded them with a bunch of electricity and stuck them in oxygen and underwater. So it was completely mind-blowing. It was the most memorable project I ever had.
Yeah, that's amazing. Just to have that sort of scale of project, and that there's always something really cool about trend setting in that way. I can see why that sticks with you. If we get into HFES a bit, then so here in the UK we have the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, which is our professional body here. Can you describe HFES to us about and what that is and how it works for you?
Yeah. So the Human Factors Ergonomics Society started in 1957. It stemmed out of World War II. If you think of the time, we were making all these amazing gadgets, essentially war machines, to help with the battles of the time, and understanding from those designs and those failures and those successes, the field of human factors was bred. You basically had systems design that came out of it, and designing systems for people. That's essentially the crux of what human factors and ergonomics is. So designing for mental and physical capacities. And so from 1957, the population grew. It later on included physical ergonomics beyond just cognitive interface. And here we are today. We're around 3,500 people in the US as well as internationally. We have 26 technical groups or specialty fields, anywhere from aerospace on one end to virtual environments on the other end. We have affinity groups that look at essentially organizations or affinity for people in marginalized communities, from LGBTQ to women and minorities to people who are in disability situations. And so we try to capture all that. And then within where I am with the executive council, we have a ton of committees, essentially the infrastructure that keeps things churning. So that's basically the crux of HFES, and then it fits under the hierarchy where you fit in, Barry, with the Chartered Institute, the hierarchy of International Ergonomics Association, which is sort of like the United Nations of connecting us all together.
Yeah, and I guess that's a really cool thing, is it, that we do have that overarching body that links us all together. It's not just a bunch of disparate organizations. There is a sort of level of coordination or engagement there. As you said, you sit on the executive committee. You're president. So, what made you run for president? Because that's quite a certainly, as you said, the undertaking of the organization of HFES is huge. So, why did you want to become president?
Yeah, it was interesting. At the time I was finishing up my term as secretary treasurer, and obviously that's more on fiduciary duties. But at the same time, I was also running symposiums like ErgoX, and it was an absolute pleasure to look at technology development and blending that in with human-centered design. And that was on the technology sort of side. But then at the same time, there was a social movement happening. We had the George Floyd event happening in 2020. This was the year I ran. I can remember sitting on the couch a couple days after that event and watching the news with my wife and my oldest daughter. I think she was 7 at the time. And so she was asking what's going on with the situation. Why is this happening to this individual? My wife and I had this deer in the headlights look. We just were like, oh crap, we don't know what to tell her. and so at that point, I kind of reached out to the HFES world in the blog area and the communities pages, just kind of asked that question out to the world. I don't know what to say. And so that kind of started formalizing, the combination of that with, I think HFES should be more impactful on the US and on the world. We can do more with human factors and ergonomics. Started making me want to run and say, all right, we need to shape HFE and HFES to be more impactful than it is today. And in this case, this was 2020.
Yeah.
So those combination of events kind of sparked my passion to move beyond the secretary treasurer, which is, mainly just looking at the financial side of the house and making sure we're stable there, to, utilizing those resources and more to be more impactful on society in general.
So, obviously, you've had that event, and that's been your motivation for doing it. I guess especially with the size of HFES, you can't just sort of rock up and say, I want to be elected. What do you have to do? What's the process involved? Can anyone do it, or?
Yeah, so you're looking at basically full members who can run, and there really isn't that much more in criteria beyond them. There's non-required stuff that's out there. So
right.
Most people look at people with more experience, right? So the candidates that tend to win tend to have senior experience. They tend to be primarily on the academic side because these are usually our professors and the people who teach us. our science, and they tend to run more often than, say, practitioners. I was coming at it from a different bend, where I was looking at it from a practitioner sense, where I felt we needed to go beyond just the science and become more impactful in government and industry and public facing activities in order to put the name out there, in order to put human factors on the map beyond just in a journal or in a publication.
Yeah.
And so doing that, campaigning, reaching out to members, sending messages, saying, here's why you should vote for me. Here's the experience that I have, coming in as at the time as an associate technical fellow. Technical fellows in general, they're known for one thing within the Boeing company as well as outside the Boeing company. They're known for getting things done. That's essentially why you become a technical fellow. It's because you have a really good knack, a really good knack for solving problems. And usually they're extremely big problems. And so having that experience under my belt, I felt I could add something to human factors and HFES by getting the organization to move into a more impactful state of mind. And we're starting to slowly do that.
So you mentioned the George Floyd event and what happened there. How has that work on equality, diversity, inclusion, or EDI influence your direction and what you've done today?
Yeah, there's been a number of things. So while I was finishing my term as Secretary Treasurer, we started working on essentially a series of action items, things that we could do within society to better the society itself within its membership, as well as potentially outside. So from a policy standpoint, so we have Government Relations Committee. They were looking at opportunities to help with human factors in government policy in general. But then we also looked at, hey, do we have any opportunities dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion, or EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion on the UK side, as you guys dub it. And that's where it started there. We also looked at ways we could finance research within human factors and that area. So we created scholarships. We came together to see how we could do discussion around these topics. So we created the Listening and Acting webinar series, and that started in 2020, and it's had a couple of different webinars since then. And the idea around that is to basically understand these different niches, from healthcare and how diversity and equity problems might be involved in healthcare, to education, to all these different nuances, to mental health. All these different areas kept popping up. And so since then, there's a ton of stuff we've been doing, Barry. Like, there's stuff that we embedded in my strategic roadmap that we created last year. There's just continuous learning opportunities. We had publications on this, and it's just the tip of the iceberg, because there's so much more work to do.
I mean, that's really good. The fact that it isn't, you're kind of not treating it in many ways as a special event. You're integrating it into what you're doing on a day-to-day basis while still flying the flag for it. That's really inspiring.
Yeah.
In the future of human factors, obviously we've got a lot going on and stuff, but what's the most exciting thing that you can sort of see on the horizon? What could you see that we really need to get stuck into?
After all the stuff that I mentioned, I think the most fascinating thing that I didn't realize until probably earlier this year was the push for advocacy. So before I came in, we had the Government Relations Committee, which their job is to basically sit in Washington, D.C. at Capitol Hill and advocate for human factors and ergonomics and help get that into policy. Interesting enough, that's at the national level, at the federal level, but it's not at the state level. And so what we're seeing, across the 50 states, there may be opportunities that pop up to create ergonomics policy. Most recently in Washington State, earlier this year, there was a policy up for ballot in the Senate and the House for the state, looking at ergonomics and reinstating ergonomics, which was historically there around 1998 to 2001, right around that time period at the federal level. That no longer exists in the US. So you have a handful of states that have ergonomics policies and regulations in place. And so this didn't end up going through for Washington State, but it'll likely come back on ballot again in 2023 or later in 22. So that's looking at it from a government relations perspective. What I wanted to do beyond that was basically broaden that lens and look at, okay, how can we improve public perception, public relations? How can we help with industry relations? So we created some new committees. We created the Industry Advisory Board, which is brand new. It's starting up. It's how do we get industry leadership to the table so that we understand their situation, their concerns, their problems, and then at the same time create a two-way avenue of communication and say, here are opportunities with human factors. And, oh, thank you for that information. We didn't realize. Let's go back, study it, put a publication or put some kind of mitigation in place that can help industry. And in fact, Boeing is the first to the table for the Partners Program. We created the HFES Partners Program with industry, with Boeing being the initial member. Beyond that, we had, the public relations. So just this month, the Executive Council approved a public relations firm. So hiring a public relations firm. So that includes media relations as well. So that's looking at it from the standpoint of, how do we tie into trade organizations? Think of, any kind of traditional publications, paper publications like magazines, all the way to any digital format. How do we tie into media? So just yesterday, for example, we had our Boeing Starliner launch, right? That was a huge media sensation. So imagine someone being on television talking about the human factors behind that launch and the astronauts and what they're seeing and the perceptions around design. That's essentially, to me, like a grand leap, moving human factors into mainstream media so that it becomes common vernacular. It was quite interesting watching astronaut Sunny Williams. She was on because she's part of the first crew that's coming up. And she actually mentioned the word ergonomics because they're doing a talk, or they're doing, a summer validation event prior to the actual launch. And she was talking about going in and testing out the systems, validating the systems, testing the ergonomics. And I was like, wait, I have to rewind that. What did she say?
He said the word.
She said the key word. Yeah. And I was like, who's paying her for that? That was awesome. So yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Getting it to that point where it becomes commonplace for us to talk ergonomics more than just the chair we sit in.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things, isn't it? I mean, certainly with some of the space launches I've been watching recently, and you sort of get on Twitter and you start commenting on things, you can sort of see some of the the general comments coming out. But when you get a bunch of ergonomists on Twitter or Facebook, or pick your network of choice, you quite quickly almost get into the nitty gritty of, well, how they're controlling that, what are they doing with that. And we need that to be that broader conversation, don't we, to get people to realize, I think, that all this interfaces isn't, it shouldn't be just defined as what you see. We can all influence it in some way, and if we make that part of that mainstream conversation, then that's really cool. So, given what you're saying around that connectivity and talking together, we can talk a lot easier now, and the fact that we can do this discussion over the pond, as it were, and have this sort of debate quite easily. What can we do more to support the global human factors community?
Yeah, going back to those three major, I guess you could say, advocacy methods. So, public relations / media relations, government relations, industry relations. Those are all equal opportunities internationally. I kind of dubbed this stuff like the circle of life, going back to, I'm a 1980s kid. So, the Lion King made a huge impression on me. But it's about the ecosystem, essentially, right? It's managing the ecosystem and growing the ecosystem so that you essentially provide solutions and opportunities and mix that with gaps and needs on the service or on some kind of product side. And so that can be done, agnostically. It can be done from any country, from any perspective. And so when you're balancing that, that's essentially where you're looking both at regional, national, and international relations, and seeing how we can find common factors or common needs and opportunities to work with each other. I recently had a webinar with Dr. Jose Gomez, who's Jose Orlando is essentially, he's out of Brazil. He's a human factors professor in Sao Paulo. And so he's down there also happening to wear the hat for president of IEA, International Ergonomics Association. So we had a webinar last month talking about international relations and how HFES can interact more with IEA and how members could get involved. And so, Jose is basically looking at ways to do these different interactions. Being that both of us are on this side of the pond, we were looking at ways to improve potentially third world countries and, basically look at human factors and ergonomics for those opportunities in the Caribbean as well as in Latin America. And so we're looking at ways to take advantage of technology, do webinars and activities that are within time zones or across time zones. That might include, cross, I guess you could say cross-disciplinary or cross border lines topics. One of the things I brought up recently, because of my background in exoskeletons, I saw some work happening in Brazil and sent that over to Jose, and he saw that, this was stuff happening in construction, roadway construction. And so that was where, those are common topics where you look at labor, you look at healthcare. These are ways that we can kind of cross-pollinate with each other.
That's really cool. And I think, yes, we've got to grow. We've always got to break down them boundaries and make sure that we are sharing that knowledge for everybody's sake. I think that's absolutely spot on. Clearly, you're going to have things you've outlined. You're going to have a great legacy as your time as president. But what have you not done yet? Is there things there that you still want to achieve? Is there things that you actually want to still go out and do before it's all over?
Yeah, so in October, I actually transitioned to immediate past president. It's my last year of my 3-year term, and Professor Carolyn Summert will take my place as president. And so in my sunset year, you can call it, I'm really looking at, how do we cement our place with partners in industry. And so I'm going to be spending more time bringing in additional partnerships to HFES and to human factors. Again, thinking at it from an ecosystem perspective, how do we create job opportunity with organizations so that we can have human factors practitioners like myself and like you, Barry, embedded in these organizations and in these companies? It has to come from the top. So we have to be able to speak the language of the C-suite, of the executives, so that they understand how important the role of human factors plays in their product design and their systems designs. And that creates job opportunity, creates funding and research opportunity. At the same time, you can do that at the government side or at the university side. So lots of work to be done there. I don't think I'll be, by the time my year's up, I don't think I'll be finished, but at least we can start scratching the itch.
It sounds like it's going to be that really ongoing piece. And if you can get it kicked off and driving, then I completely agree. From a very selfish perspective, I kind of want to pick your brains because I've been elected as president-elect of the CIEHF, and obviously next year I'll pick up our presidency. With what you've been through, what you're going through, and what you've been through, have you got any advice or you've got any tips of things that I should be doing or maybe avoiding in my year?
So I would say that the presidency is daunting. At first, it overwhelms you with, oh crap, I have all this stuff in front of me. What am I gonna do? It's like now that you assume the helm, you're like, oh, wait, I'm in charge. What do I need to do? So fortunately, you're coming into an elect position. You have a year that you can shadow your predecessor with, and start gaining your foothold. Beyond that, what I would recommend is something that I didn't realize until the last couple of years is how much a role politics plays in your day in and day out. So understand the needs of your council, your members. Spend a lot of time talking to people. I can't tell you how often I'm on late at night working different time zones, or early in the morning like we are right now, just talking, just reaching out and understanding everybody's needs, and then seeing what I could do on the essentially the operation side of the house with the executive leaders to move towards solving the problems and the needs that people have. Getting the organization into a more, I guess you could say, agile and reliable state is not easy, but you can take one step at a time and understand that you probably won't be able to, bite off the whole apple, but you can take a bite out of the apple, a couple bites at a time. And by the time you're done, hopefully it's in a better position for your successor as they come along than when you got it originally. So just look at it from that perspective. You're doing incremental, continuous improvement.
Well, I shall take that on indeed. I think that's certainly that idea, that communication thing, I think is just probably so vital. And hopefully with these sort of technologies and things that we can use now, that should be sort of easier. But as long as we keep on doing it. Thank you very much for that advice. I really appreciate it. So now we're going to the final three questions. So I ask these questions of everybody I interview, just because it makes my life a bit easier and quite amusing. Do you have a favorite book or a paper? Now, this can be technical or it can be fiction, because I know some people go back to the fiction books that you go back to repeatedly all the time that you keep using.
I'm going to give you a double answer to this one. So nonfiction wise, I fall back on my Cromer book, which is basically Ergonomics, how to design for ease and efficiency. That was during that fundamental time where I realized ergonomics actually matters. And that's where I wanted to pursue the field. And I still reference that book all the time. In my day job, when I'm looking at situations at hand, I still refer to it. I have tons of tabs in there where I just quickly, what's energy? Let me look at the energy section, or let's look at the biomechanics section, or any of those areas. So I'd say that's my go-to book all the time.
Cool.
Now, on the nonfiction side, there's the inspiration side, and I tend to move my head for this. So I don't know if you can see that back there. That tends to be my inspiration. I was up late last night watching the new Star Trek series. What is it? Final Frontier, I think it's called. That's out on Paramount. And so my parents are in town, and so I was basically, it was a weird moment because the premise of the show is it's like pre William Shatner, pre Captain Kirk,
right?
Christopher Pike. It's around the time when my dad was watching that stuff, so I was watching it with my dad, and it was kind of like an amalgam of 1960s type Star Trek mixed with present day Star Trek, current technologies and capabilities. So it was an interesting moment that keeps me inspired to keep pushing the boundaries. So the combination, I would say.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. So if you could go back to your younger self and go and have a chat with Chris, I don't know, about 16, maybe something like that. What advice would you give yourself for then?
It's not going to be easy. There's been a lot of stumbling blocks that I had to go through. I would say, don't give up hope. There's going to be tons of struggles that you're going to go through. Some of them will be extremely depressing, but you can pick yourself up. You can move on and persevere. And I would say the hard work and the diligence will pay off in the end.
Brilliant. And just because it makes my life slightly easier, have you got any suggestions about who else I should get into the hot seat? Who else I should interview on this podcast, do you think?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a standard name in industry right now. She's a hot name out there. So Micah Ensley, Dr. Ensley is part of she leads our government relations committee. She's also known for situation awareness. She's essentially one of the founders in that field. And so she's president of SA Technologies. I would say standard issue human factors. Let's talk to Micah.
Cool.
Beyond Micah, I would, put on my Boeing hat and say, why not talk to somebody cool? So you have Captain Mike Bryan. Mike is actually above me. So I'm a technical fellow in the organization. Mike is one of our senior tech fellows. He happens to be a chief pilot and a human factors practitioner. When you talk cool stuff, he can tell you things from his military days, working fighter craft to what he does on the commercial side now. So that would be an interesting take.
Both of them sound really fascinating, and hopefully we can do something about potentially teeing that up. Chris, I recognize your time is really precious. You're really busy. I really appreciate you taking the time today to chat to us, not only about your own background and your own drive, but actually educate. I've learned new stuff around HFES and how that operates, and hopefully how we can cooperate better in the future. So thank you ever so much for your time. And hopefully this interview will be going out fairly soon. And yeah, really appreciate all of your input.
Hey, thanks, Barry. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you. Find me whenever you need me. Take care.
Thank you for listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. Please do get in touch with your thoughts, questions, and comments. You can contact us on social media such as Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook at 1202 Podcast. See you next time. And remember, it's more than just common sense.